Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Big Bass Podcast, the fishing show where size matters. I am your co-host, Ken Duke, dressed in my period outfit.
And I'm Terry Battisti. Our producer and engineer is Nathan Benson. In this episode of the Big Bass Podcast, we're climbing into our Wayback Machine to check out some stories of big bass from the 19th century.
You know, Terry, bass fishing did not start in 1932 when George Perry allegedly caught a world record. It didn't start in 1967 when Ray Scott held the first modern bass tournament. And it didn't start when any of us made our first cast.
No, it's been around a lot longer than that. In this episode, we're going to go back and forth telling some stories about big bass from the 1800s. So, Ken, why don't you start us off?
Well, Terry, to that end, I've got my old pocket watch here, which actually has a bass on it. Just so I'm, again, for folks watching on YouTube, I hope you'll check us out because here I am in period costume, and Terry's there in his T-shirt drinking something.
And he drives me to drink.
Well, there's that. But Terry, as comes up so often, I think I'm swallowing part of my mustache.
That looks like a freaking weed guard. You pulled those off a couple of Klein weapon jigs, didn't you?
I maybe. At some point, they might have been part of a trailer. Let's kick it off with a story that happened in 1878, apparently. And it has to do with one of our heroes, a guy by the name of Dr. James Alexander Henshaw, the Cincinnati physician who was really the first great advocate of the black bass. The guy who said, inch for inch and pound for pound, it's the gamest fish that swims. And the guy who wrote the first two books on bass fishing. In 1881, he wrote Book of the Black Bass. In 1889, he wrote more about the black bass. But it wasn't until much later, in 1920, that he wrote a couple of things that tell the story of a 20-pound largemouth bass that he apparently caught in the San Sebastian River of Florida. And the first mention we have of this, they're both from the same year, but in his book, Bass, Pike, Perch, and Other Game Fishes of North America, he said, in Florida, I have taken it on the fly up to 14 pounds and up to 20 pounds with natural bait. In May of the same year, 1920, he was getting his autobiography published in a serialized form by Forest and Stream magazine, which was later bought by Field and Stream magazine. But this was kind of near the end of Forest and Stream's run, and for 27 consecutive installments between May 1919 and July 1921, Henshaw was publishing his autobiography. It has since been republished by Whitefish Press.
Clyde Drury.
Yeah, Clyde Drury kind of spearheaded that with Dr. Todd Larson, who owns and runs Whitefish Press. And so you can get it all right there. You don't have to go back and collect those 27 issues of Forest and Stream, which would be tough to find and expensive.
And Clyde was a dear friend of mine, and I would like to say he was probably a dear friend of yours too, Ken. Clyde had what I would consider the most complete, nothing against your collection of books and magazines, Ken, but the most complete collection of books and magazines ever written about the bass. And it was
the
donated.
indignity.
He donated it. Clyde passed in 2015, I believe it was. And he donated that entire library to Washington State University, where, unfortunately, I don't think anybody's ever looked at it since it was donated.
Where it will never be seen again, I'm afraid.
Yeah, exactly. But Clyde, if you can get a copy of Clyde's work on this autobiography of Henshaw through Whitefish Press, it's worth its weight in gold. Awesome.
Yeah, Clyde's other magnum opus would be his bibliography of all the bass books ever published, which was
Books of the Black Bass.
Thank you, Books of the Black Bass. Pretty exhaustive bibliography. Every once in a while I'll go through there to try to see what am I missing. And
Yeah.
I'm assuming that Clyde had basically everything on that list. I don't know
Yeah.
where my library ranks, but it's
It's close.
I'm chasing Clyde. I'm chasing what Clyde
Yeah.
had.
Yeah, without a doubt. Anyway, back to Henshaw.
Yeah, back to Henshaw in the May 1920 issue of Forest and Stream magazine. He wrote about a trip he made to the San Sebastian River, right here in Florida, where I am, and 1878. I'm sorry, and he talked about the enormous bass that he found there, and the particular passage that's critical to our show tonight, or show today, or show tonight, this morning, whenever you're watching. He said, "It was my natural ambition and fond wish to capture a black bass that would exceed the record. Then, my wish was gratified when I landed a colossal black bass that weighed 20 pounds." Now, that's a really interesting reference for a couple of reasons. One, I think neither Terry nor I can find an earlier reference to this fish. And it's kind of hard to believe that the man waited 42 years to tell the story.
Yeah, so I've been on this research path now for this episode for the last 2 weeks. In the last 2 days, I've spent 12 hours looking up, big fish that were caught in the 18th century. And I find Henshaw references, and not just references, but his quotes in at least a dozen different newspapers, and they're all different columns, where he states that his biggest fish to date was a 14-pounder. Nowhere. And my search bracket was 1800 to 1899. And nowhere in there did he mention a 20-pound fish.
Well, I've run some searches as well, and my searches ran from 1800, or really, I think I actually started about 1860 because Henshaw wasn't publishing anything before that.
Yeah.
And they ran until 1920, and I don't find anything except what we see in his book, which was called Bass, Pike, Perch, and Other Game Fishes of North America, and also in his autobiography. So I don't know where the good doctor came up with this. I don't want to say
Mr. Henshaw the first hoaxer? Was Mr. Henshaw the first hoaxer?
I would hate to think that. But it also becomes interesting because of the next fish that I'm going to discuss. Terry's got a story he's going to tell us first, but the next fish that I'm going to discuss, because that fish would have outweighed Henshaw's 20-pounder that he claimed was the record. But we'll get to that in a moment. In any event, one of the early references to a gigantic bass, a 20-pound fish, comes from none other than Dr. James Alexander Henshaw, 1878.
Yep. All right. So I'm not going to talk about a particular fish, but I'm going to talk about what I found interesting, and it goes into big smallmouth. And the reason I think it's interesting is that you do not hear about this state at all when it comes to big smallmouth. And that state just happens to be Indiana. And so when you think of big smallmouth bass, you think of, Dale Hollow here in Tennessee. You think of Lake Erie. You think of Dworshak Reservoir out in Idaho. You think of a couple of lakes in California, all lakes that have produced 9-pound plus bass, and even fish that are pushing the 10-pound or over the 10-pound range. But running through this exercise the last couple of weeks of trying to find big bass catches in the 19th century, I found a report that was published in the Sun newspaper out of New York, New York, and it was printed in February of 1889. And the title of the column was Indiana's Thousand Lakes. And evidently there's an area of Indiana, and it's the northeast corner of the state, that has 1,000 small natural lakes that range from about 10 acres up to 400 acres in size. And the column states that these lakes are all natural habitat of the smallmouth bass, and that every single fish that was transplanted throughout the United States at the time all came from these lakes, which I found was kind of interesting. If we could get Barden maybe to do some DNA analysis,
And of course, you're talking about the terrific bass fishing biologist,
Yeah.
fisheries biologist Stephen Barden, who's been a guest of
Exactly.
ours a few times now. Folks, check out those shows.
Yeah, it would be really cool to collect scale samples or DNA samples of fish to see if they really go back to this area of northeast Indiana. And anyway, it says in the column where they're quoting this ex-fish commissioner Dennis, where he said the smallmouth black bass that inhabit the various waters of this country come originally from that group of Indiana lakes. So that I found was kind of interesting. But he also states that nowhere else on the continent except in a small lake near Glen Falls, New York, which I believe he's talking about Hopticong, these fish have been caught equal in size to those taken from these Indiana waters. He says the largest black smallmouth bass on record was caught by A.N. Cheney of Glen Falls in the lake I mentioned. It weighed 10 pounds. But that fish was an exception to the ordinary run of bass in that lake, while 7, 8, and 9-pound bass are not uncommon in the Indiana lakes. And then he goes on to say that Sidney Smith of Rome City, Indiana, caught a smallmouth bass in Sylvan Lake that weighed 9 1/2 pounds, and a Dr. Moyer of Kendallville killed one that weighed 9 pounds in the same lake. He ends it with Sylvan Lake is the largest of these Indiana Big Springs, its natural size having been enlarged by damming to make it a reservoir in the days of canal navigation. So, Ken, what do you think about that?
Yeah, true. When we go back and do the deep dive on the really old stuff, the 19th century stuff, the early 20th century stuff, we run into a lot of issues. A lot of the times I'm wondering if these fish that guys are calling smallmouths are really smallmouths. If they're calling them largemouth, are they really something else? And this is one of those things, because these guys back at that time, they were not judging the species of fish most generally on things like scale counts or certainly not on DNA, which wasn't available. But they were just, if they thought the mouth was disproportionately small relative to the size of the fish, they might call it a smallmouth, even though it was a largemouth. And as far as the provenance of so many giant fish and the origin of all these smallmouth bass coming from Indiana, color me skeptical. I'd love to hear what a really knowledgeable and talented biologist would have to say about that.
Well, but let me throw this out there, and I can't remember if it's actually in this column. I have it saved. We can go back. But in a number of the columns that I read, they got pretty damn gnat's ass into describing how to identify a smallmouth compared to a largemouth. They went with the rows of scales between the dorsal fin and the lateral line. They talked about the scales along the lateral line and how they differ between the two species, and they talked about the jaw not extending past the eye, whereas in a largemouth it does. And I was blown away by these 1870s descriptions on how to identify a smallmouth. They were pretty damn spot on.
That sounds pretty dialed in. It really does. So I'm curious.
Yeah.
But yeah, as you noted right at the top, though, Indiana not really known for their giant smallmouth bass. The state record is 7 1/4, and that was taken back in 1992. So it took them until 92 to build up to that mark. Hard to believe that there were 9 1/2s and 10s running around at that point.
But if there were, what the heck happened to the fisheries?
Yeah.
And is there anybody watching the show that's from that northeastern corner of Indiana that can vouch for any of these lakes, namely Sylvan? Is it still around? Does it still have the same name?
Well,
throw us down a comment in the comment section.
Of course there are people listening from that part of the state, Terry. There are tens of millions of people checking out the Big Bass Podcast even as we speak. And if you're not, keep your eye on the watch and subscribe subscribe, like. Terry, before I go to the next story, I'd like to point out that I went to the trouble of growing this fabulous handlebar mustache, especially for this program, and I don't see the same commitment.
I have no commitment, Ken.
Well, you should be committed.
I hate to commit.
Your fear of commitment is duly noted, sir.
I still don't know if this is going to succeed.
I still don't know if I'm going to swallow this mustache.
I want to go back. It's a jig. Weed
it is
guard.
a jig trailer. It's a hair jig trailer, unfortunately.
And the hooks. You have the hooks in your lip. Is that what's keeping it there?
That's what's holding it in. They're in the nose, and that's what's keeping it going right now. So kind of awkward.
God! All right, let's get back onto the get back on this.
Back on the rails. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
This one is a flashback to the very first episode of the Big Bass Podcast. You can't talk 19th century leviathans, giant bass, without talking about H.W. Ross. H.W. Ross caught a 23-pound, 2-ounce largemouth bass in 1884. Or so he says. And I shouldn't say 23.2 because that's actually the number reported by James A. Henshaw when he referenced this fish in 1889 and more about the black bass. According to the newspaper reports contemporaneous with the story, this fish was 23.5 pounds. And I don't want to go into too much detail because we took the deep dive back when we did that in the first episode of the Big Bass Podcast. But basically, this guy H.W. Ross was fishing a lake near Altoona, Florida, and he was fishing a minnow, and he wound up catching on basically a cane pole. He wound up catching a bass that measured 37.5 inches long, 29.5 inches in girth, and he had all kinds of provenance for this fish, Terry. He had all kinds of measurements for this fish. He sent parts of the skeleton, the skull, to Forest and Stream magazine back at that time in 1884. There was just a lot to give him some credibility in this case. And we did a deep dive, of course, which we always do on this show. And we learned that H.W. Ross was actually a gentleman by the name of Horace Warren Ross, born in 1852, somewhere in New York State. Makes him either 31 or 32 years old when he caught this big fish. According to a Jacksonville, Florida address directory, he worked as a traveling agent, so he's probably some kind of salesman. I believe he died in the late 1890s, so he's still a relatively young man at that time. But we know that because in 1900, his wife was listed as head of household in the census, and then later she's listed as a widow. So he must have passed away about that time. But you know, Terry, one of the things we talked about in that show is that there's a pretty compelling case for H.W. Ross. His fish came from the right place. Central Florida's got the genetics.
We put the measurements in the Big Bass Podcast calculator, and it bracketed it perfectly.
Yes, and folks, if you're not familiar with the Big Bass Podcast calculator, it's something that Dr. Battisti here devised years ago, and that thing is money on fish weighing 14 and a half pounds or more. If you can enter the length and girth measurements, that sucker will dial you in. And it pegged Ross's claimed weight basically to the ounce. So, and you factor in that Ross was trying to share as much information as he could by getting all these measurements and sending the skeleton and so forth to Forest and Stream magazine. I got to say that I think this is the biggest bass ever caught fair and square.
And I agree. I mean, it's and to have Henshaw talk about it in his book More About the Black Bass in 1889, and then say that he caught a bigger fish and completely disregard H.W. Ross's fish in his memoirs, I sense a little bit of jealousy that Henshaw may have had.
Yeah, exactly. My response is simply this. It's, what the hell, Dr. Henshaw? Come on, man. And since I'm dressed like a Henshaw contemporary, I would say, sir, what cause have you to call this fish into question? But it's there's an argument, and I think a pretty good argument that Ross should have the world record even to this day. And
Yeah.
Henshaw's
I mean,
claim.
if we're going to count Perry, we might as well count Ross.
Well, if we're going to count Perry,
And then it would bring the record back to the United States.
and to Florida, most importantly.
Oh God, maybe we should leave it in Japan.
Terry is so anti-Florida, unbelievable. Well, Terry, you've got another one. For anybody who wants to check out the Ross story in great detail, and I honestly believe that even though it was our first episode, I still think it's one of our best. I hope you'll check it out. Nathan's going to put the link up here. Terry, you've got another cool story from the 19th century.
Yeah. So again, this is a story more about the times than a specific fish, although it is about a specific fish. It takes place in Missouri, and the fish in reference is, there's only one sentence written about it, but the entire column is essentially the author complaining about the transplanting of bass, specifically largemouth, throughout the states. And it was a column that was written in the St. Louis Democrat, February 13th, 1898. And it was under the Rod, Gun, and Kennel News column of that daily issue. And what they're discussing is, at this time, none of the famed Missouri reservoirs are in existence. All right, Table Rock doesn't exist. Lake of the Ozarks doesn't exist. Truman doesn't exist. All these, these tributaries, these canyons are essentially just rivers and streams. And the smallmouth was the natural fish of the day, except for in maybe some of the slower moving waters. It wouldn't be until 40 or 50 years later that they would start building the dams that would impound those what are now famous bass reservoirs, many of which the largemouth has really prospered in. And so the column essentially talks about the big-mouthed bass having no material benefit to the state, the angler, or the market. And here's here's a little of the column for you to get the feeling of the disdain that this writer had towards the big-mouthed bass. And he stresses big-mouthed bass, in my opinion, as a way to put it down. And so anyway, here's a quote from that column. It says, "Now the big-mouthed bass is all right if he would stay in swift running streams, but not liking rapid water will make for his native element when put in these mountain streams. The Mississippi River and the lakes and sloughs tributary to it is where he thrives. The smallmouth bass is native to our streams. If the Fish Commission of our state would raise and plant this fine game fish in some of our Ozark mountain streams, they would be doing work that will bring results. A smallmouth, something many didn't know at the time, but then the author goes, into the size difference between the two. So he's, saying that the big mouth, it is a slow, lazy fish that lives in, mucky waters, is no good for the state, and that he wants the smallmouth to be planted more so, in his rivers. Then he goes on to say that the smallmouth bass does not attain the weight of its brother, the largemouth. He used largemouth. The former rarely weighs over 7 pounds, while there was one of the later from Peters Lake weighing 14.5 pounds. So right there is a data point that someone caught a largemouth out of Missouri in the 1800s that weighed 14.5 pounds. Now, I don't know what the problem is with this guy, but I'd like to catch a 14.5 pounder, even back in the day, especially back in the day. It would be eaten as as dinner, and probably dinner for a couple days. But I don't understand his his beef with the big mouth bass. But go ahead.
No, I was going to say, yeah, that 14 and a half that they're claiming back in the 19th century here, that's more than a half pound heavier than the current Missouri state record largemouth. And usually when guys start berating bass, this guy's a little bit unusual, I think, Terry. I'd love to get your take on it, because he's really only attacking the largemouth. He's not attacking the smallmouth. And usually they go after both. And usually they go after both, and they support trout. And if you're a regular viewer or listener of the Big Bass Podcast, if someone ever asks you your favorite kind of trout, I would suggest you say almondine, because because that's my favorite. And
I prefer it cooked fresh on a camp stove, or a cast iron skillet with some onions and some mushrooms, soy sauce, and olive oil. That's my favorite way to enjoy a trout.
As you can tell from my attire on this program, I am still fighting that 19th century battle between the bass and the trout.
Oh, geez. Anyway, so here's a little bit more about what this writer feels about the largemouth. He says, "The largemouth is not the fastidious fish that we have found the smallmouth to be. For, although sometimes he inhabits the same waters, he also thrives in sluggish, muddy streams and ponds of a warmer temperature that are shunned by the smallmouth. Amid the reed, lily pads, and water weeds, he is content to pass his days like some big fat, person, right? He is a coarse fish for the table, and tastes and smells of the muck. He is not so handsome, and while there is a difference of opinion about his game qualities, the weight of evidence against him in comparison with the smallmouth."
Oh, this guy had a real axe to grind.
Oh yeah, big time.
I never quite understood that. I get it if a guy has a favorite fish over other fish, but I don't understand why they're taking down a fish. When I say my favorite trout is almondine, I'm joking. I really enjoy trout fishing from time to time, but I would never seriously try to attack the trout. And this guy was actually not by any means rare for the period. A lot of people took their shots at the bass back in the day.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy, but maybe I can understand, where this guy's coming from, because you got to put yourself back in the time. I mean, none of the lakes existed. It was all the mountains of the Ozarks.
Terry, I think I clearly have put myself back in the time. If you'll simply
but you're not. Your mind. You may look that way, but your mind isn't there, Ken.
Contraire. My mind is as backward as any you're likely to find.
But getting back to my point, they're used to fishing. Probably. Well, we all know that the trout was a king in the Ozark Mountains before the inundation of the making the lakes, and they probably really respected the fight of the smallmouth and fishing them on a fly rod or a bait casting rod. This guy was probably a fly fisherman by the sounds of it. But
and that was basically the choices. You were either a live bait fisherman or you were a fly fisherman. And
right.
This guy had his issues.
I never expected to hear someone complain about a 14.5-pound bass. I mean, I sometimes shake them off when they're that light. I'll shake them off, but yeah,
but I don't denigrate them.
Yeah, no. Anyway,
all right, I'm up next, and
carry on.
I'm gonna go really close to the 20th century here. I'm gonna go from a story that actually appeared in the early part of the 20th century, but it tells a story of something that happened in the late 1890s. And just to be perfect, Terry, the title of this story, and it came from the Philadelphia Inquirer, February 4th, 1900. The title of the story is Biggest Black Bass Ever Recorded. When I see that, I freak out. I can't tell you how excited I get to run into a story called something like that. And this story is about a 24-pound largemouth bass caught in a private pond at Ellerslie, which is an area on the Hudson River. So there was a guy named Mr. Morton, and he was having his pond cleaned out. The pond was about 100 years old at this point, and according to the article, it was apparently filled with fish. And while the water was being drawn off, spillway or something like that, a breach in a dam, the owner of the place, Mr. Morton, went there to see what was going on, what was living in there. And this fish was not caught on a rod and reel, but it was caught as the pond drained, and it weighed 24 pounds. 24 pounds. There were a lot of witnesses to the catch, a lot of witnesses to the weighing of the fish, and it's a big deal because I need to tell you who Mr. Morton was. It all comes down, or a lot of it comes down to who Mr. Morton was. Now, first of all, if somebody wants to tell me there's a 24-pound largemouth bass taken in New York, immediately that raises red flags. Because, the biggest largemouth bass out of the state of New York weighed less than half that.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets a little interesting. Mr. Morton was actually Levi Parsons Morton. He was a minister and the son of a minister. His brother was the mayor of Toledo, Ohio. His sister was the mother of an assistant secretary of state. Levi Morton was a successful businessman. He made a fortune in business and ultimately merged his company with J.P. Morgan, one of the great American magnates of all time. Levi Morton,
who was pretty ruthless with his employees.
Pretty ruthless with employees, pretty ruthless with his business practices.
It's because of people like J.P. Morgan is why we've got unions today.
Absolutely. Morgan was not known as a humanitarian particularly, but he was known as a ruthless and wildly successful businessman.
Yeah.
Levi P. Morton was a civic leader. He served on the board of trustees of the American Museum of Natural History. He got elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. He was the U.S. minister to France. He was a governor of New York, folks.
Politician.
And
politician.
He was vice president of the United States under Benjamin Harrison from 1889 to 1893. This is not some clown claiming a giant fish. This is one of the most highly regarded, revered, and respected people of his day. And he is telling us, and other people who are witness to this are telling us, that this fish weighed 24 pounds. Now, the closing sentence of this story, I'll read the whole thing, but I'm mostly interested in the last part. He said, there were many witnesses to the capture and weighing of the fish, and it was likely vouched for by Mr. Morton. The weight has been accepted as the record for black bass. There are darned few references to records in that era. But this is one. This is one of the very earliest. You don't hear it called a world record or a world's record, as was more common in that era. You're not hearing them say it's a state record or an area record, but they're just saying it was a record. And at the time, this is before Watergate. This is before a lot of political scandal and stuff. A couple of years before Watergate. But this was an era when if a government official, especially a vice president of the United States, said something, that was pretty much the gospel. I feel pretty confident this is a case of mistaken identity, and that this was not a largemouth bass.
So was this lake or pond connected to the river in any way? Is it possible that it was a striper? I mean, God forbid that it was a catfish and they mistook a catfish for a bloody bass. I mean, what are your thoughts on how this got confused? Or was the scale bad? Were they weighing it on a Langley Delier?
I'm not going to attribute this to a bad scale, because that would that would have to mean they didn't know the difference between, say, 10 or 11 pounds and 24 pounds, likely. I'm not sure about how close it is to the actual Hudson River, but I'm guessing it was quite close because his property was on the Hudson River. If the Hudson flooded, would it reach the pond? I don't know. But I'm willing to assume that it would. I'm willing to assume that this could have been a striped bass, absolutely. And a 24-pound striped bass, well, a good fish, is not a world-class fish by any means. I don't know what to make of it. That's my initial reaction, was that this was a striped bass. But they seem pretty clear about this. A big mouth bass, a 24-pound black bass. They refer to it not once, but twice, 3 times actually, as something other than just bass. If it was just bass, I could assume it was a sea bass. But they call it black bass twice, and they call it big mouth bass once. So I'm curious.
Politics and religion. You know, you've got the guy is both, and we know today what they're capable of.
All I can tell you, Dr. Battisti, is that if Kamala Harris came out and said there was a 24-pound big mouth bass, I'm in. Ha! That's a joke on my part. I would not believe the queen of word salad. Yeah. But it is interesting, you know. And what makes it interesting is this is not some backwoods guy spotting a UFO. No. This is the Vice President of the United States.
I tend to believe the backwoods guy more than I do.
Well, there you go. And Terry, I think you got another story for us.
Got one more, and again, it's not about a specific fish. This is more of a fish story that I found kind of comical. And it starts out, it came from the Buffalo Courier, Buffalo, New York, in 1895. And it's a story about a group of anglers that were fishing in Taylor County, Florida. And let me set the story with this passage out of the column. It said, "Here was encamped a party of 7, and one of them was a devil. 6 were pillars of the church, but the one swore, drank, lied, fished on Sunday, and otherwise battered the Decalogue." There's a word for you, Ken, from the 1800s.
I love that.
What does Decalogue mean?
I assume he's referring to the 10 Commandments.
Exactly. All right. His knowledge of woodcraft, however, rendered him invaluable. So, on promising faithfully not to swear, drink, fish, or hunt on Sunday, he was enrolled with this pious band. In other words, it sounds like this guy is someone that I, like to share a boat with. Come hop on in, let's go fishing on Sunday.
I'm hoping he's looking for a tournament partner, but
yeah, exactly. So anyway, so these guys end up camping for days on this river in Taylor County, Florida, and wouldn't you know it, it rains, it blows, the water's high, it's just horrible conditions, and all they can do is sit in camp and wait it out. And guess what day it finally clears up, Ken?
Well, I'm guessing it's Sunday. Now, I would dream of cloudy, light breeze out of the west, that kind of thing. But tell me what they had. All
right, so it clears up on Sunday. They wake up in the morning. The birds are chirping. There's not a nary a wind. The sky's perfect. A little bit of clouds here, and it's a perfect day for fishing. And so what they're doing is it says in the column, and I'll recite it here. All were sprawling around the camp, smoking and wishing for Monday to come, when the sudden swish of water disturbed, told them that a big black bass was rising. One after another, the big fish splashed around after their dinner until the crowd was nearly wild. Finally, the hardened sinner of the party broke two of his promises. He swore fluently that he would fish or be damned. Soon he was busy with a big black bass. It is well to state here that Florida bass attain to the great weight of from 12 to 18 pounds. This one was a 12-pounder. All restraints were thrown to the winds. Everyone made all the haste to try to unveil the big wary fellows. Two started out in the canoe down the stream, one paddling, the other trolling. All went well. The fish were large and took eagerly. But, and what a but, it was too good to last. In passing under an overhanging limb, there fell plump into the boat a huge, slimy water moccasin. Like startled frogs, both boatmen dived, leaving his snake ship in complete control. Now, Ken, I think there's a moral to the story here, but I'm not even going to go close to it. Why don't you give us a synopsis of,
Well, as a lifelong Southerner, I can tell you that if a cottonmouth or water moccasin gets into my boat, I'm going to throw him the keys because it belongs to him at this point, and I'm gonna jump out. I don't care if there are alligators out there. I don't care if there are sharks out there. I am getting out of the boat. It now belongs to the cottonmouth.
Well, the end of the story, it says that the cottonmouth ate all their big fish and couldn't get the last one in. And so what did it do as it left the boat? It finished the last remaining fish around its tail into a knot and drug it over the side of the boat. It's a hilarious story. Can you imagine a snake eating like 4 or 5 10-pounders? Yeah, maybe the pythons that you have down there now, but yeah, not a water moccasin.
It's crazy what passes for journalism these days, but it can't really touch what passed for journalism in those yellow journalism days of the late 19th century.
Yep. Yeah, but here's another reference to Florida fish between 12 and 18 pounds. No mention of a 20-pounder, or a 19-pounder, or a 23-pounder.
They're thick as flies down here. The 12s to 18s, we usually don't even bother to set the hook.
Yeah. Oh man.
Well, this is a story. This episode actually on these 19th century big bass is a lot of fun to me. I really get a kick out of researching the old newspapers and books and magazines. So I don't think it's fair for us to say we're going to slam the door, although you will see the door slam at the end here. But because I hope that we'll revisit this kind of stuff. But hopefully this is enough to wet everybody's whistle for some more of these things. Because Terry and I are really into the history of it all, and this is fun. So thank you for joining us on this one.
Yeah,
and
if you like this format and this type of old stories that really aren't relevant to what we're doing today, but they're fun and it kind of gives you an idea of what these people were going through back in the time. If you like this stuff, let us know in the comments. And
if you like my costume, my outfit here, definitely say something derogatory about Terry.
As usual. But I like these. I mean, every time I delve back into the 1800s, I learn a ton because there's always stuff that you missed on prior searches, and it just it's a cool way to go back and see what these folks were dealing with back in the day. So.
A blast. Dr. Battisti, can you take us out?
Yeah, sure. It's time to slam the door on this episode of the Big Bass Podcast. But before we go, please remember to subscribe, do all that. You guys are awesome in the comments. We love interacting with you. Please don't stop. Continue. And don't forget to check out the website at thebigbasspodcast.com. There we have, the Big Bass Podcast calculator, state records, world records, etc. If you need to contact us, our email addresses are ken@thebigbasspodcast.com, Nathan at thebigbasspodcast.com, and Terry@thebigbasspodcast.com. I'm Terry Battisti on behalf of my partners Ken Duke and Nathan Benson. Thanks for joining us. Be sure to check back next week. We'll have a new show about a different big bass with a story that you will not and cannot find anywhere else. And always remember, size matters.